Okay, so you're here, which means, you know, you like getting to the bottom of things.
Straight to the point. Right.
Yeah,
I'm messing around.
exactly. And today, well, we're diving deep into something pretty fundamental, sex and gender. And, through, like, the feminist perspective.
Yeah.
Feminist thought.
And get this. We're going all in with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the big leagues.
Like the ultimate authority. Right.
Yeah.
So consider this our little exploration, an intellectual adventure, if you will, into some really core ideas in feminism.
We're talking, the heart of the matter.
Totally. The goal here is to kind of unpack how feminists see sex and gender, how they find these terms, the big arguments, the whole shebang, and of course how all this differs from how we, well, maybe, how we usually think about these things.
Right, like the everyday understanding.
Yeah. And look, we know you're a curious bunch. You're here for a reason, so we're aiming for insightful, thought-provoking stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump right in. The sex-gender distinction, like where do we even begin?
It's interesting. Feminism has this way of, turning everyday assumptions upside down. We tend to use sex and gender pretty interchangeably in everyday speech, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But feminist theorists, they've drawn a pretty sharp line.
Oh, a critical one, for sure.
Yeah. So for starters, we've got sex, generally referring to the biological stuff. Chromosomes, anatomy, hormones. The nuts and bolts.
The hard wiring, so to speak.
Right. And then on the other side, we've got gender, which points more to, the social and cultural stuff. Roles, behaviors, identities, all the things associated with being a man or a woman.
Okay, so two distinct categories. But why? What's the point of making this distinction? Our source is pretty clear on this, right?
It all boils down to fighting back against biological determinism.
Ah, right. That whole biology is destiny thing.
Exactly. It's the idea that our biology, our genes, whatever dictates, everything. Our social roles, behaviors, even our potential. And here's where it gets really interesting, philosophically speaking.
Oh, yeah. The philosophical implications. It gets deep. I love it. So, way back when, like late 19th century, we had these guys, Geddes and Thomson, and they came up with this theory, the metabolic theory. I mean, can you even believe it?
It was a different time, that's for sure.
It was. But they basically said that men, because they're catabolic, meaning they expend energy, they're just naturally more active, more inclined to politics, that kind of thing. And then women, on the other hand, are anabolic, right? Conserving energy. So they're inherently passive, no interest in the public sphere.
And all this, supposedly rooted in biology.
Yeah.
Tied back to our very cells.
It's mind-blowing, right?
Yeah.
But what's really fascinating is how they use these scientific-sounding claims to justify the way things were. The power imbalances, the social hierarchies.
Right, like the status quo.
Yeah, it's like a classic case of science being used to kind of crop up existing power structures.
And they weren't subtle about it either. They literally said that fundamental biological differences, going all the way back to the simplest life forms, meant that, trying to create social equality was basically pointless.
Like trying to fight against nature. And they had this super quotable line, something about how what was decided among prehistoric protozoa
cannot be annulled by act of parliament.
There you go.
Oh.
Powerful stuff. And this shows exactly how people use biological essentialism to resist change. Specifically denying women rights, political rights.
So yeah, a very clear example of how ideas about human nature have real-world consequences.
Right. Huge consequences. It's fascinating. Okay, but then, you have Simone de Beauvoir coming in with a totally different perspective.
Right, a real philosophical bombshell.
Yeah. Her books, The Second Sex, I mean, it's legendary. And she had this amazing line, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman."
Mic drop.
Right. I mean, it's so powerful. Her argument, which became super influential in feminist thought, was that, well, social forces shape us so much, so deeply, that it all starts to seem natural, even biological. There's this illusion of a predetermined female essence. But for Beauvoir, it's just not true.
It's a constructed essence, if you will.
Right,
yeah.
Totally. Okay, but even with Beauvoir's critique, these deterministic views, they didn't just disappear, did they? They're like zombies. They just keep coming back.
They're persistent little buggers, that's for sure.
They really are. Even in the 1970s, we saw these arguments against, say, women being airline pilots because, supposedly their hormones would make their judgment, unreliable.
Right, as if men's hormones are never a factor.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
ridiculous. And then more recently, the focus shifted to the brain, right? Remember those studies on the corpus callosum in the early
Ah,
90s?
yes, the corpus callosum, the bridge between the hemispheres.
Exactly. And like there was this Time magazine article, I think, it suggested that women have a larger corpus callosum, which explained, women's intuition, but then also supposedly made them worse at spatial reasoning, things like reading maps.
Always with the maps, right.
Oh, always. But thankfully, we had some brilliant minds pushing back against these claims.
Like the philosophical heavy hitters.
Yeah. Our source mentions Anne Fausto Sterling, and she had
Yeah.
some, like, devastating critiques. She pointed out, for instance, that the size of the corpus callosum, it, like, varies a lot between people.
You can't just draw these neat lines based on sex.
Exactly. And she also pointed out that these, supposed sex differences, well, they're not there in babies. So it's not like we're born with them. They develop later, which suggests, environmental influence. And the most crucial point, I think, is, well, there's just tons of evidence that skills like spatial reasoning, they're influenced by practice and experience
I'm like,
massively. So even if there are, some small biological differences, they definitely don't mean that that women can't be amazing pilots or, architects or whatever.
right, like biology isn't some rigid blueprint.
No,
Okay.
not at all. Okay,
Okay.
but, as we're talking about all this, I'm struck by, like, how the actual language we use has evolved. The term gender as separate from sex, it didn't always exist.
It's a relatively recent invention, linguistically speaking.
So where did it come from?
Well, our source says it really gained traction in the 60s through the work of Robert Stoller, a psychologist. He was working on transsexuality. Yeah, and this led him to differentiate, like, sex is biological, you have that at birth, but gender is more about your psychological sense of being, masculine or feminine, and how you express those traits outwardly.
Uh-huh. Okay, so it was really about creating a framework for understanding people whose biological sex didn't match their internal sense of self.
Exactly, a way to acknowledge that experience.
Okay. And then feminist thinkers like Gail Rubin, they like totally grasped the power of this distinction.
Right. Oh, they saw the potential.
It gave them this like crucial tool to argue that, so many of the apparent differences between men and women, the things we see, the behaviors, the roles, that, well, they weren't, biological destiny. They were like socially constructed.
Meaning they're changeable,
Yeah.
not fixed.
Exactly. And Rubin, she introduced this really influential concept, the sex gender system.
Right. A key concept in feminist thought.
And she saw gender as this socially imposed division of the sexes, this system that actually reinforces women's oppression, keeps them down.
In her vision, it was radical. She imagined a future, like a genderless society, but not sexless, mind you, where like your anatomy just didn't matter. It wouldn't dictate who you are, what you do, who you love.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah.
So basically, like, biological sex might still be a reality, but all the social stuff built on top of it, all the expectations, roles, inequalities, like all that could just, well, disappear.
Become irrelevant. Poof.
Poof. I love it. So how does all this fit together? The earlier understanding of sex and gender.
Well, the encyclopedia describes it as like a coat rack view.
A coat rack view. Okay, I'm intrigued.
So the idea is you have these sexed bodies, right? Those are the rack. And then society comes along and hangs like all this gender stuff on top of them. Masculinity, femininity, expectations, the whole 9 yards. It's saying, okay, you have this body, therefore you must.
Right. It's a prescription for how to be.
Yeah.
Based on your body.
Exactly. And of course, making this distinction, it opened up like this whole new philosophical territory because suddenly you could see how sex and gender they could come apart.
Oh, right. Like they're not always aligned. They're not one and the same. Okay. That makes sense. So to kind of summarize this whole initial part, we see this core idea emerging.
Yeah.
Gender is socially constructed. It's not like hardwired into us. It's a product of social practices, norms, expectations.
It's a process, not a fixed state.
Right, a process. But then, of course, the big question is, well, what exactly is this social construction? Like, how does it actually work?
Yeah, good question. How do we go from, being assigned female at birth to becoming a woman, as Beauvoir put it? Let's dig into that.
Okay, so first up, we have this idea of gender socialization.
Right, a classic way to understand this whole becoming process. It basically says that, individuals assigned female at birth, well, they become women by internalizing all the stuff that comes with it. feminine traits, behaviors, roles, all through this like complex process of learning and reinforcement.
So it's nurture, not nature, taking center stage here.
Exactly. And we see this really clearly in, say, Kate Millett's work. She saw gender as being like fundamentally cultural. It's the accumulation of, all those ideas about what's appropriate for girls and boys instilled by, parents, peers, the whole culture.
Oh, it's like constant messaging, right, from every direction.
Everywhere. And Millett, she was really sharp in pointing out that, these seemingly harmless social norms, they actually serve to keep women in a subordinate position.
Right. They reinforce the power imbalances. Like, girls are socialized to be passive, to be, emotionally expressive in certain ways, but not others, and to be, oriented towards serving men's needs.
Yeah, all these things that subtly limit women's options and opportunities.
Exactly. But the important philosophical point here is that if these roles are learned, then, theoretically they can be unlearned.
Right. It opens up the possibility of change. Like, we're not stuck.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's not destiny.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does this socialization thing actually play out? Like, where do we see it in action?
Oh, everywhere. Philosophers who study social learning theory, they found it happening like from the earliest moments of life and operating on all these like subtle, unconscious levels. It's amazing, really. Like there are studies where they observe parents describing their babies, within the first 24 hours of life. And even then they're already using these like incredibly gendered stereotypes.
Wow, that's kind of wild.
Right, like boys are described as strong, alert, while girls are tiny, delicate, and it's not even intentional most of the time. But this early linguistic framing, it can like subtly shape how parents interact with their kids, right? It reinforces these gendered expectations from the very beginning.
It's like setting the stage for everything that follows.
Exactly. And then of course you have the more obvious, the explicit stuff.
Like the pink and blue thing.
Oh, yeah. The pink and blue, the toys, the clothes, that whole marketing machine, just, constantly reinforcing these ideas of like what girls and boys are supposed to be into.
It's inescapable.
Mhm.
And while, like, things have changed somewhat since, like, the second wave of feminism, I think those underlying patterns, they're still there, aren't they? Like, girls might still be, I don't know, subtly discouraged from playing rough sports,
Right. Push towards more traditional feminine activities.
Yeah. Well, boys, they're often told to, like, toughen up, not
Mm.
to cry, to suppress their emotions.
It's this constant transmission of like societal norms,
Right.
a never-ending loop.
It's a loop. Okay.
Yeah.
But it's not all about direct interaction, is it? Like, kids also learn about gender just by watching the world around them,
So
right?
yeah, observation is huge. They pick up on the patterns they see in books, in movies, everywhere.
Ah, the power of representation. I'm thinking about, like, those classic children's books, where the boys are always the brave adventurers, the heroes, and the girls are like the helpers, the damsels in distress.
It's a recurring theme, isn't it? And it can be really insidious, even when people are trying to be more balanced,
Yeah.
introducing more gender-neutral characters. It's like parents often end up like regendering them in their storytelling without even realizing it. Like they'll say, oh, look at the brave little princess.
It's so ingrained, right? Like, we're all swimming in this sea of gendered expectations.
It's hard to escape. Okay, so we've talked about social learning theory, but then we have Nancy Chodorow, who offers, I'd say, like a more nuanced view.
Right, a more complex account of how gender develops.
Yeah, she draws on psychoanalytic theory, and she argues that, social learning theory, it's a bit too focused on just like observable behavior. She wants to look deeper into the psychological structures, the unconscious stuff.
Okay, so what does she focus on?
The early relationships, specifically the mother-child dynamic.
Ah, right. So important.
It's foundational. And her main argument is that, in many societies, women are the primary caregivers, right?
Yeah, that's definitely still true.
And so she says the mother-daughter relationship and the mother-son relationship, they actually play out differently in really crucial ways. Like mothers often feel this stronger sense of identification with their daughters.
Right, they see themselves in them.
Exactly. And this can lead to less clearly defined ego boundaries for girls. They develop a greater sense of like interconnectedness, less of a rigid separation between themselves and others.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. While boys, they're encouraged to be more separate, more independent.
Yes. Because with sons, mothers, maybe unconsciously, but they push for more separation, more independence,
Mm.
which leads to more rigid ego boundaries, a stronger sense of like, I am me and you are you.
Okay, so these like early relational patterns, they kind of lay the groundwork for how men and women typically behave as adults.
Yeah. That's exactly what Chodorow argues. She links these early differences to those classic, gender stereotypes, like women tend towards emotional dependency, right? They have trouble separating their needs from others' needs. While men, they're often, emotionally detached, they prioritize their own autonomy. And it all goes back, she says, to those early relational patterns.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. It's all connected. So what's the solution? What does she propose?
Well, her solution is pretty radical, actually. She advocates for like a complete restructuring of parenting practices, like equal involvement of both parents in childcare, breaking those traditional patterns. And she believes that, this could lead to future generations developing less rigid, less gendered personalities.
Okay, interesting. So it's not just about like telling boys it's okay to cry. It's about like fundamentally changing the way we parent.
Exactly. It's about like shifting those deep-seated patterns. Okay, now, for something completely different, we have Catherine McKinnon. She brings in a very different perspective, and it's pretty intense, actually.
Yeah, McKinnon, she's like known for her really, really sharp critiques of patriarchy.
No punches pulled. And her whole theory of gender, it's grounded in power dynamics
Yeah.
and sexuality.
Okay, so like how does that play out?
Well, she argues that the very meaning of sex, like what we understand as gender, is it's created and maintained through the sexual objectification of women. That's the core of it.
Right, that women are constantly seen as objects of male desire, and this is what like defines their place in society.
Exactly. And her definitions are like really in your face. She defines masculinity as sexual dominance and femininity as sexual submissiveness.
Oh, wow. Straight to the point.
It's brutal, but effective. And so, for her, gender isn't primarily about learned behaviors or even those deep psychological structures we talked about with Chodorow. It's constructed through the eroticization of this whole dominant submissive dynamic.
Like that's the foundation of how we understand gender.
That's what she's saying. And so for McKinnon, all those liberal feminist goals of like achieving gender equality, it doesn't make sense within this framework because the categories of man and woman, they're inherently defined by this power imbalance.
It's baked into the system. Okay, so like male dominance creates this whole system where women are objectified, and then that in turn creates gender. Is that what she's saying?
That's the essence of it.
Yeah.
And she argues that, even those seemingly natural sexual desires and expressions, they're not innate. They're socially conditioned.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're not born with these desires. They're imposed on us. That's a pretty big claim.
It is. But she argues that men, they're conditioned to find women's subordination arousing. And at the same time, women are conditioned to find a certain kind of submissiveness, the male-defined version. They're conditioned to find that erotic.
Oh, I see. So we're all being manipulated.
We are. And she points to pornography as like a key player in this because it perpetuates this distorted image of what women supposedly want, and it conditions male sexuality along these very specific lines.
Right, like dominance and submission.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there's the threat of male violence to back it all up.
Exactly. The power dynamic is always there, lurking in the background. So for McKinnon, it's clear. Male dominance comes first. It shapes everything.
Wow. Okay. So we've looked at like gender as a learned social role and then as influenced by psychological development and now as this product of power dynamics and sexuality. But, all these theories, they kind of rely on this idea of a unified category of, woman or man.
Yeah.
But is that really accurate?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And a lot of feminist thinkers, philosophers especially, have started pushing back against this idea.
Oh, right. Like it's not as simple as it seems.
Not at all. It's like way more complicated. So let's dive into some of the critiques, the challenges to this initial sex-gender distinction.
Yeah, let's unpack that a bit.
Okay, so a lot of the accounts we've talked about, they work with this underlying assumption of gender realism.
Okay, gender realism, what's that?
It's the idea that like women as a group, they share some core characteristic, a common experience, something that, objectively makes them women and distinguishes them from men. Like there's this essence of womanhood.
Okay, I see. But But some philosophers argue that, like, a universal experience of gender, it just doesn't exist.
Right. And they have some pretty strong arguments to back that up.
Okay, so what are those arguments?
One of the most powerful critiques is what's called the particularity argument, and it was like really strongly articulated by Elizabeth Spellman.
Elizabeth Spellman. Okay, so what did she say?
Well, her point is that like a lot of mainstream feminist theories, they don't fully account for all the other things that shape how gender is experienced, race, culture, class, ethnicity, nationality, all that stuff.
Ah, the intersectionality.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that, like, if womanhood was this single universal category separate from all those other aspects of identity, then, all women would experience it in the same way, right? But
Yeah.
that's obviously not true.
Right. Like a woman's experience in, say, rural India is going to be wildly different from a woman's experience in, I don't know, New York City.
Totally. And even within a single society, right?
Right.
Women of different races, classes, they'll have vastly different experiences. So Spellman is basically saying, hey, we need to, like, zoom out and see the bigger picture here.
Okay, that makes sense. So, like, how does she illustrate this point?
Well, she uses several examples, but one of the most striking is she takes on McKinnon's concept of sexual objectification. The idea that this is like a universal condition for women under patriarchy.
Right, right.
Well, Spellman and others, they point out that, historically, women have been objectified in very different ways depending on their race and class. Like, take the example of slavery in the U.S. Black women were systematically hypersexualized, right? Treated as like perpetually available for sexual exploitation.
Oh, yeah, a really horrific part of history.
It is, and this happened at the same time that, white women were being idealized as embodying purity and sexual virtue.
Wow, so two totally opposite experiences of objectification happening at the same time. That's pretty powerful.
It is, and it shows that like the experience of objectification, it's not, one size fits all. It's deeply shaped by systems of power, by racism, by classism.
Right, it's all interconnected. Okay, and Spellman, she came up with this really great term, white solipsism.
Ah, yes, a classic critique.
So what does that mean exactly?
It's basically calling out the tendency of some, white Western middle-class feminists to like unconsciously project their own experience of gender as the universal experience, as like the golden nugget of womanhood. They assume that all women are just like them, struggling with the same things, but they fail to recognize how, race and class fundamentally structure and differentiate women's lives.
Right, it's like assuming everyone has the same starting point when, we clearly don't.
Exactly. And Spellman, she has this really powerful analogy to illustrate this point. She says it's like assuming that, within the black woman's skin, there's this white woman just waiting to be discovered. Like that's the real essence of womanhood. And it's obviously like deeply problematic.
It is. It erases so much. Okay, so are there any like real world examples of this?
Oh, tons. But one that comes to mind is like Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. It was incredibly influential, but her analysis was really focused on like white middle-class women who were, stuck in those domestic roles in the post-war era. And she really tapped into that sense of dissatisfaction, of oppression that many women felt.
Right, it resonated with a lot of women.
It did, but her analysis, it didn't really account for the fact that, lots of non-white women and poor women, they were already working outside the home out of necessity. Like their experience of womanhood was totally different.
So even though Friedan's work was groundbreaking in many ways, it was still like limited by her own perspective, by her own social location.
Exactly. And that's Spellman's main point, right?
Yeah.
Social conditioning, it doesn't just produce like a single category of women. It produces particular kinds of women whose experiences are shaped by all those intersecting factors.
Okay, that's really helpful. So we've got this critique of gender realism, but then it goes even further, right, to the normativity argument.
Ah, yes. This is where Judith Butler comes in. And she really like pushes the critique to a whole new level.
Okay, so how does she build on Spellman's argument?
Well, she agrees with Spellman that, unitary gender notions, they're inadequate. They can't capture the diversity of women's experiences. But she takes it further by saying that these attempts to define like a single coherent category of woman, they're actually inherently normative.
Okay, normative meaning.
Meaning that they set up a standard, a correct way to be a woman. And this inevitably leads to, marginalizing and excluding those who don't fit that mold.
Right, like it creates this ideal, and then anyone who deviates from that is like somehow less of a woman.
Exactly. And so the problem isn't just that we might, get the definition of woman wrong. It's that the very act of trying to create a single definition, a universal definition, it becomes a form of like social and political policing. It legitimizes certain experiences and delegitimizes others.
Wow, that's a really interesting point.
It is. Like, think back to Chodorow, right? Her psychoanalytic account of feminine personality development.
Right, right.
Well, Butler might say that, that model, it implicitly suggests that only women who develop along those specific psychological lines are like real women. And that's really problematic.
It is. It's exclusionary.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we get out of this trap of defining woman? What does Butler propose?
Well, this is where her famous concept of gender performativity comes in, and it's really quite groundbreaking. She argues against this whole idea of like a stable underlying gender identity, this core self from which our actions and expressions flow.
Ah, right. Like the idea that, deep down inside, we're truly a man or a woman.
Exactly. And Butler, she's like, nope, not buying it. Instead, she says that gender is instituted through a stylized repetition of acts.
A repetition of acts. Okay, so what does that mean?
It's about, all the things we do, the way we dress, the way we move, the language we use. It's all these little performances, these actions that create the illusion of gender.
So it's not about who we are, but what we do.
Exactly. Gender is a verb, not a noun. It's a doing, not a being.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So like if I put on a dress and makeup and like speak in a certain way, I'm performing femininity.
Exactly. And by repeating these actions over and over, it creates this sense that like that's who you really are, but it's an illusion. It's a social construction.
Okay, and why do we do this? Like why do we perform gender?
Well, Butler argues that it's largely driven by societal norms and expectations, and especially, heteronormativity, the assumption that everyone is straight.
Right, right. Expert speaker.